Hello, this is Philip Williams with another lecture on Noah's Ark and Scripture Science. This lecture, I think you're going to find very interesting, how reimagining the evidence of Noah's flood as an ice age, which I've been talking about in the last lecture, pushed back mankind's beginning to cavemen of a supposed old Stone Age. Now, this will create the first and greatest scientific challenge to the Bible. It made it difficult to fit Genesis with the scientific view. And I'm going to show you what's wrong with that scientific view and how much better the light of the Bible explains the origins of early man. Now, the review, what we've been talking about, remember that the founders of geological science who established the geological column and the ones that determined that the earth is really very old, however, they also discovered the evidence of Noah's flood, and they accordingly referred to it as the diluvium. Now, I mentioned several kinds of evidence that they had, but I'm just going to refer to two today. One are the sudden extinctions of these megafauna on every continent. These mammoths and woolly rhinoceros, and even in America, you had the disappearance of the horse and camel that weren't here when the Europeans came. So a flood very well explained these sudden extinctions. And the other important evidence I'll be talking about now, I'll just refer to, are these erratic rocks. How do you explain these rocks are found far from their place of geological origin, but what kind of processes could have put these rocks where they are now? The only thing they can imagine that could do that is the very rapidly rushing waters from a flood. So that's why they believed in the diluvium flood. However, I've also explained in the last lecture how Charles Lyell's gradualism challenged the diluvium catastrophism. And of course, he published this in his book, The Principles of Geology. And I pointed to these barnacle incrustations on these Roman era temples, which he used as evidence that the land had been slowly rising and falling since the time of the Romans. And so he sometimes people refer to as uniformitarianism, and that was Lyell's doctrine, but it was really the gradualism that Lyell was using to explain away the flood. He used a gradual extinction of animals not by flood, but by human hunting, using that a theory that had been proposed by the Scottish Reverend John Fleming. And then those rocks we were looking at just a minute ago, he proposed that what happened is they were lying at the bottom of the ocean, and they got frozen because of the change in elevation, and they got frozen in icebergs, and these icebergs would drift over the land very slowly now, and deposit them there. Now it's an absolutely scientifically impossible theory, but Lyell was a lawyer, and people were. It had the superficial appearance of being scientific, so they wanted this, but it was so bad that another theory would soon replace it, and that was the Ice Age theory. You see some of these rocks on top of the glaciers. It was proposed that glaciers had been moving this rock, a slow-moving frozen flood. But of course, that's equally impossible. Yet people believe it to this day. But the Ice Age theory, which was promoted by Swiss geologist Louis Agassiz, who came to America, and then William Buckland, who was the primary teacher that the diluvium was Noah's flood, switched to Agassiz's teaching about the Ice Age. And so this Ice Age theory has been the doctrine to this day. Now, one of the reasons why they had difficulty with the diluvian flood is they had made mistakes. They wrongly believed that the flood was due to a sudden change in elevation between the oceans and continents. It was sudden and catastrophic, unlike Laos, which was very gradual and over a long period. But both of them had changes in elevation between the oceans and continents as causing these phenomena. And of course, that is not what the Bible teaches about the waters of the flood. According to the Bible, what these waters come from beneath the earth. Since the antediluvian world, however, the world before the flood would have been under the ocean, this meant that all the archaeological remains had to date from after the flood. They taught that at the time of the flood, that mankind had not spread outside the lands of the Bible. So, however, if you did find archaeological remains in the diluvium or beneath the diluvian deposits that were associated with extinct animals, this would be strong evidence that Noah's flood was the source of these deposits. Yet, because of their, and in fact, several of these had been found. Several of these associations between extinct animals and humans had been found, and even Buckland himself had found some. But what they would do, whenever evidence was found of this, the geologists Cuvier, Buckland, and Lau, they would attribute these to intrusions from latter times. So they didn't serve as evidence of the flood. And another reason they were inclined to reject them is based on embalmed animals that Napoleon's troops had brought back from Egypt to Paris. Cuvier taught that animals had existed in their modern form, at the creation of man, the animals were already in their modern form. So there was not even what we now know as adaptations, which we know occurs. But Cuvier was very, very dogmatic about this because he was defending his extinction theory. But again, all the archaeological sites supposed as dating after the flood, now they're going to be supposed as having been built after the Ice Age. And this is going to affect the archaeology in a big way. Now, now we've got no evidence of man, but we do have an Ice Age. But there was a French a man named Butcher de Perse who found these human tools in gravel pits in France, Somme Valley near Abbeville, France, and here's human tools with extinct animals. He publishes these observations in 1836, calling them diluvium, thus supposing them as evidence of the flood, and which is exactly what they were. But Lau and geologists, they reject and ignore them for that very reason. But de Perse shrewdly publishes them again in 1848, this time referring to them as antediluvian, not necessarily from the flood, but they could be from ancient times before the flood. In 1858, the geologists started paying more attention to de Perse. An English geologist named Hugh Falconer, who was in the area, visited the site near Abbeville, and he when he goes back to England, he recommends Sir Joseph Prichwich and John Evans visit the site. So the geologists are talking among one another, and they agreed that de Perse had indeed found these things. So in 1859, Prestwich reads a paper to the Royal Society confirming not only de Perse's findings, but also several in England, showing that man had in fact existed with these extinct megafauna animals. And it was a big event. It was attended by Lyell, by Huxley, we know as Darwin became Darwin's book bulldog, and Michael Faraday, who was very famous scientist, and Lyle immediately, he jumps on the bandwagon now. He said, "I'm fully prepared to establish these conclusions." But because he had this period now being stretched out through his graduates, instead of being now, to be honest, both Prestwich and John Evans, they were prepared to look at these as evidence of man in the flood, having drowned in the flood. But Charles Lyell was in fact, this is the same year that he's having Darwin publish his theory of evolution by natural selection, which at that time was not about man. But the point is Lyell is controlling the marketing of the archaeological consensus. And in fact, in 1863, he publishes this very important, influential book on the antiquity of man. Then, now it's important to note that the Ice Age, even Lyell has now accepted the Ice Age. But since the Ice Age is covering the land, the people who these spear points belong to, they had to live in these caves, somehow or another protecting themselves from the Ice Age. So that's where your notion of the cavemen comes from. Now, about the same time, Darwin's neighbor, Sir John Lubbock, publishes the most influential archaeological text in the 19th century. He was a banker and a neighbor of Charles Darwin. Due to the belief that the glaciers covered Europe, hunting weapons found were supposedly belonging to those in the caves. But the archaeological remains not in the caves must have followed the Ice Age. Now, of course, that was not the case, but that's what they believe. But Lubbock develops this typological chronology based on supposed advancement in tool making. So he defines the men in the caves as the old Stone Age, and they made rough tools, the stone tools, the weapons, kind of like Indian arrowheads. He calls them the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic men. And then in these mounds, though, they had some more polished weapons. He calls these the New Stone Age, and because of this thinking that they had that originally that the flood, that man had not been in the flood, but now that the glaciers are covering this is really giving an extinction between the New and Old Stone Age that is just being driven by the theory itself. And of course, he publishes this text, Prehistoric Times, in 1865. But in fact, these mounds had the similar rough stone tools that were found in the caves or found in the mounds. But we're just considering the dogma. In fact, what's driving a lot of this is what's called social Darwinism, which dominates evolutionary thought from even from before Darwin, well into the 20th century. Now, what that means is social Darwinism is that the strong eliminate the weak, and you see here eugenics. It satisfies both sociology, how we should treat the poor, and also it gave a theory of the development of man. It was first taught by Herbert Spencer, and Spencer's libertarian teachings were patronized by people with money and by the neo-colonials. This is the time they're moving. The British are trying to get rid of the Aborigines of Australia, and this was justified because it was science. And Darwin himself, his defenders try to defend him from social Darwinism, but the subtitle he changed his Origin of Species to the subtitle "The Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life." So, in fact, Darwin himself is supposing that these fugitive people that he had found at the southern tip of South America would soon be eliminated. His description of them that he had visited himself, they were very nasty. So this nastiness is going to figure in Lubbock's teachings. But social Darwinism, the point, it became a presupposition of archaeological prehistory. And of course, the basis of Lubbock's archaeological theory, he also publishes another text on the primitive conditions of man, based entirely not on archaeology but on living tribes, and now he's going to project it into archaeology. He believed that living savages. Now, everybody in the 19th century uses the term savages. We don't use that term today. It's a demeaning term, but it's used by everybody in these times. So we got to understand how people were thinking when these theories developed. And he believed that these savages were incapable of culture development. Therefore, they're going to be soon eliminated. It was an excessively racist teaching. And of course, the point here is he's projecting this social Darwinist thought into archaeology. And as I mentioned, he learned from Darwin that earliest man was excessively nasty. So that was his point. He kept, and he strongly insists, though, that man, though gradually improves if he has the racial capability of doing so. So the white men improve, but some of the colored people races will not be able to improve. So he's insisting on his dogma of evolution. He strongly denied that mankind's culture, when people move, has ever degenerated. There were some people that were, especially following the Bible, that were imposing this dogma of unilinear evolution. One was Irish Bishop Richard Whately. Whately made the statement, he said, there's no evidence that, again, using this term savages that everybody was using it, ever unaided have ever developed a less barbarous way of life. He said it follows that humanity, he concluded, it follows that humanity must once have existed in a state far superior to that of modern savages. And of course, the Bible points to the fact that, well, whatever the people we find now, barbarians or savages, they all had to rise to what appears an advanced civilization at the time of the Tower of Babel. There was another geologist, very influential Canadian geologist, Sir John Dawson, had some similar views, but it was based more on scientific principles alone. He argued against Lau, who he was close friends with Lau, that the Pleistocene gravels, these supposedly Ice Age gravels, the human remains argue for the recency of these gravels rather than for the antiquity of the people in that. He pointed out that American natives who used the best made stone implements also used the rudest. And he made he said the development in sequence in Europe might not be a temporal development at all, but might just represent local trends with neighbors of a higher culture, which is exactly what was the case. And he said there's no evidence that cultures of different levels of complexities have not existed from earliest times. Now, both of these men are essentially correct, but it's not the fashion of at the time these theories are being developed, and so they were essentially ignored. So you probably have hardly heard of either of these men. But it's not necessarily racist to believe these things. My ancestors who came from Europe to America, all of a sudden we had to have homemade. We didn't have the fine material culture that existed in Europe at the same time. So migrating and getting away from civilization, and getting more or less isolated from civilization, it is a cause for man spreading through the earth as and finding what the explorers actually found in time of human. Now there was this unilinear evolution was very fashionable. There was Lewis Morgan in America who had a similar teaching that the Marxists love. But I want to mention another Sir Edward Tyler, who was, as a former Quaker, Tyler was not a racist. He believed that all mankind everywhere possessed identical abilities. But he taught that mankind passes through 3 stages of cultural evolution. The early stage should be in savagery, then into barbarism, and then finally into civilization. It's from Tyler that we get this concept of primitive, what we see as primitive tribes. He said there are certain tribes that we found that don't have a culture, that they are mean earlier. Now, in truth, they're no more primitive or earlier than we are. All mankind basically comes from the same stock. But we get the term primitives. But he taught, though, that early man, not because of his racial capability, but because he's early man, he's excessively fearful. So he develops this religion to explain his fears called animus, the powers possessed by various animals and parts of nature. And the important thing is he's teaching that early man was excessively religious, and the more education you get, the less religious you become. And hence, it became natural to see these graves that had been created by the floods under these mounds that to be interpreted as religious burials. So people are not looking at, and apparently until I brought this out in my 2011 book on the archaeological evidence, these prehistoric, which are clearly people that have been drowned, but they've been seen as religious burials. So, but Tyler teaches that science is advanced through education that rids themselves of religion. In fact, he thought that believing the biblical God is a survivalism from our primitive times. So, believing in God is, according to Tyler, was not advanced. Of course, this was very influential. Now, there was a chronology that was developed from these supposedly old Stone Age men from French caves by a disciple of Charles Lyell named Edward Lartet. Now, Lartet, he develops a chronology that maybe seems more scientific based on the gradual extinction of animals. So the oldest sites that had the most primitive tools came to be known as hippopotamus age, and then the site that De Perse had found that ended in accepting the antiquity of man with mammoth and woolly rhinoceros site. That's these animals are thriving at that time. Of course, these animals can be thriving at the same time, but Lartet he's trying to develop a chronology. Then, when these other more advanced tools that they chipped and make flakes and make other tools, he refers to as the cave bear age. And then finally, there was this reindeer age when the most advanced tools would be found. But shortly thereafter, another French man named Gabriel Mortellet, He decides to name these based on the caves in which these were found. These earliest and most what they reckon most primitive tools that some were associated with Homo erectus. Of course, these associations are maybe fortuitous, but anyway, he called the Acheulean. And then there was the Mousterian or sites that we now say, well, these are Neanderthal lived in these sites. But these names, and then the Cro-Magnon man, the Aryan nation, but these are named off these French caves. And there you see at the end where they found these beautiful paintings in the cave on the cave walls, and that was seen as mankind developing into a more advanced state. But this was based on a chronology that definitely wasn't the case. Now, to summarize all this, the chronology, there's two kinds of chronology. There's relative dating and there's scientific dating, but there was no scientific dating at this time. But the dating of prehistoric sites were based on imaginary development from the dogma of unilinear evolution. And this became the consensus, and it really remains. There's been a lot of modifications to it, but it remains today the consensus of scientific prehistory. But in fact, all these sites were probably more or less contemporary and ended by the flood about 4,500 years ago. This means that mankind may not be older than about the 6,000 years or so that's in the Bible. But to challenge this consensus, consensus is going to remain unless you have a good alternative. One must have an alternative. The problem is the creationists, who are the main ones that have been teaching a worldwide flood, they still accept the Ice Age, so they don't have an understanding of human beings. In fact, they accept this relative chronology. They want to redate it of the old Stone Age. So here, according to creationists, Noah's family, they go from the old Stone Age to the pyramids. In fact, it's just this time period. It probably have any time really all this to occur between the flood and say the early Bronze Age. And Abraham lives in the Middle Bronze Age, which begins around 2000 BC. But it becomes so creationists, whether they're old or young, or if they have a problem. And the reason is they have been deceived along with everybody else on the old Stone Age. And I think perhaps in my next lecture, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about creationism and how we can become more scientific by getting to a more scriptural view of the scientists than what of the ancient world and what the creationists teach. But it also will simplify and really make it such an advance in understanding ancient man that it will simply have to be accepted. It was too much late. So thank you for being part of this lecture on the dating of the Antiquity of man.